The morning sun streamed through the windows of room 203 at Springfield Middle School, casting long shadows across the freshly polished floors. A young boy sat quietly at his desk, his fingers nervously tracing the edge of his new textbook. His dark eyes took in every detail of the classroom, from the motivational posters on the walls to the neat rows of empty chairs slowly filling up with his new classmates. This was Alex's first day at his new school, and everything felt different from his old one. The hallways were wider, the lockers were a different shade of blue, and even the air smelled unfamiliar, like a mix of fresh paint and lemon-scented cleaner. He reached up to touch his hair, carefully styled in neat locks that his grandmother had helped maintain just yesterday. "You look handsome," she'd said, her warm smile giving him the confidence he needed for this new beginning. What none of his classmates knew, and what the school staff hadn't been told, was that Alex's father was actually their new principal, Mr. Richardson. It had been a family decision to keep this connection quiet, at least for the first few weeks. "Give yourself a chance to make friends on your own terms," his dad had suggested over breakfast that morning, adjusting his own tie in the hallway mirror before they left home separately. As students filed into the classroom, Alex noticed how they naturally formed their usual groups, friends who'd known each other since kindergarten, sharing summer stories and comparing class schedules. He pulled out his notebook, the fresh pages ready for a new start, just as his teacher walked in. Mrs. Thompson stood at the front of the class, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and her lips pressed into a thin line. She began taking attendance, her eyes scanning the room as she called out each name. When she reached Alex's, there was a slight pause, a barely noticeable shift in her expression that only someone watching closely would catch. Throughout that first morning, Alex tried his best to blend in. He raised his hand when he knew the answers, kept quiet when he didn't, and followed every instruction to the letter. But he couldn't help noticing how Mrs. Thompson's gaze lingered on him longer than necessary, how her smile never quite reached her eyes when she spoke to him. During their first writing assignment, Alex worked carefully on his summer vacation essay. He wrote about the family trip to the Science Museum, about the experiments they'd done in the interactive lab, and about his dream of becoming a scientist someday. When he handed in his paper, Mrs. Thompson barely glanced at it before placing it at the bottom of the pile. At lunch break, a friendly boy named David invited Alex to sit with him and his friends. They talked about video games, their favorite subjects, and the upcoming school science fair. For a moment, Alex felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Maybe this new school wouldn't be so bad after all. But when they returned to class, he noticed Mrs. Thompson watching him with that same strange look. As she handed back the graded morning assignments, Alex saw the red marks scattered across his paper like angry scratches. The grade at the top, a minus, made his heart sink. He'd never gotten anything lower than A++ before. Looking around, he saw other students comparing their grades, most of them A's and B's. David, who sat next to him, had written a similar-length essay about his summer at soccer camp and received an A. Alex swallowed hard and tucked the paper into his folder, trying to ignore the knot forming in his stomach. As the afternoon wore on, small incidents began to pile up. Mrs. Thompson interrupted him twice while he was answering questions, something she didn't do with other students. When he asked to sharpen his pencil, she made him wait until 3 other students had gone first. During art period, she walked past his desk without offering help, even though she stopped to assist every other student in his row. The final bell couldn't come soon enough. As Alex packed up his books, he thought about whether to tell his father about his day. He knew his dad would want to know, but something held him back. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was just having a bad day. Maybe he was imagining things. Walking down the hallway toward the exit, Alex passed his father's office. Through the glass panel in the door, he could see Mr. Richardson in an animated discussion with another teacher. His dad caught his eye and gave him a sly, encouraging nod. Alex managed a small smile in return, clutching his backpack a little tighter. That evening at home, when his mother asked about his first day, Alex kept his answer simple. It was okay. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at his ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something more challenging than he'd expected. Still, his grandmother's words echoed in his mind. Stand tall. Be proud of who you are. Tomorrow was another day, another chance to prove himself, and he was determined to face it with courage. As weeks passed at Springfield Middle School, the crisp autumn air brought changes to more than just the leaves outside. Inside room 203, the atmosphere grew heavier with each passing day. Alex had settled into a routine, but Mrs. Thompson's behavior toward him had become impossible to ignore, even for his classmates. One morning, while Alex was solving a math problem at the board, Mrs. Thompson stood behind him, tapping her foot impatiently. "We don't have all day," she said, her voice sharp enough to make several students look up from their notebooks. Alex's hand trembled slightly as he wrote the final answer, which was perfectly correct. But Mrs. Thompson merely said, "Sit down," without acknowledging his work. During the same class, when Lisa, a girl with blonde pigtails, solved a similar problem more slowly and made 2 mistakes, Mrs. Thompson's voice turned honey-sweet. "Take your time, dear. Math can be tricky, but you're doing just fine." The contrast was so stark that David, Alex's friend, shot him a concerned look from across the room. At lunch that day, David finally spoke up. "My mom's a teacher at another school," he said, pushing his apple around his tray. "She says teachers aren't supposed to treat kids differently like that." Alex just shrugged, trying to seem unbothered, but inside, his stomach was in knots. The situation reached a new level during their history presentations. Each student had to talk about their family heritage. When Alex proudly shared stories about his grandmother's civil rights activism and his family's deep roots in the community, Mrs. Thompson interrupted him halfway through. "That's enough," she cut in, even though he still had 2 minutes left according to the timer. "We need to give others a chance." Yet when the next student spoke for an extra 3 minutes about their summer vacation, completely off topic, Mrs. Thompson beamed and called it wonderfully detailed. Word of Mrs. Thompson's behavior began spreading beyond room 203. Other teachers noticed how she would make comments about Alex's hair during faculty lunch breaks. "I don't understand why they can't just wear their hair normally," she'd say, loud enough for several teachers to hear. Most shifted uncomfortably in their seats, but few spoke up. Mr. Chun, the science teacher, was one of the few who showed obvious concern. He started finding reasons to walk past room 203 during Mrs. Thompson's class. Once, he even stepped in to borrow some chalk right after hearing Mrs. Thompson's raised voice through the door. His presence seemed to temporarily calm things down, but he couldn't always be there. One day, while grading papers, Mrs. Thompson made a show of holding Alex's essay at arm's length as if it might bite her. "The handwriting is absolutely impossible to read," she announced to the class, though Alex's writing was as neat as any other student's. She marked it with AD, despite David later saying it was one of the best essays he'd read. The other students started noticing patterns too, how Mrs. Thompson would wrinkle her nose when walking past Alex's desk, how she'd ignore his raised hand in class discussions, how she'd blame him for any noise in the classroom even when he was quietly reading. Some students began standing up for Alex in their own small ways. They'd purposely point out when he knew the right answer or ask him for help with their homework where Mrs. Thompson could see. A few even started wearing their hair in different styles in solidarity, though none of them really understood the deeper significance of what was happening. Alex's performance in other classes remained excellent. In Mr. Chen's science class, he was thriving, his experiments always thorough and creative. In art class, his projects were displayed in the hallway. In PE, he was picked first for teams. But in Mrs. Thompson's class, his grades kept mysteriously dropping. At home, Alex started having trouble sleeping. He'd lie awake, rehearsing answers to simple questions, terrified of making even the smallest mistake in class. His mother noticed he was quieter at dinner, pushing food around his plate instead of sharing stories about his day like he used to. Some mornings, as Alex walked to school, he'd see his father's car already in the parking lot. He knew Dad was working hard to improve the school, holding meetings about inclusive education and student welfare. The irony wasn't lost on him.